Last week marked a turning point in Canada-US relations when US Commerce Secretary Lutnik delivered a stark message in Toronto: America first, Canada second. This Trump-Canada tariff strategy was supposed to shake Canada's auto industry into submission, forcing production south or facing consequences. But what began as economic intimidation became the catalyst for something Washington never anticipated: a surge in Canadian independence and economic diversification that's reshaping North American trade permanently. The Canada auto industry threat from Lutnik wasn't just tough talk. It represented the Trump administration's broader strategy to fragment North American manufacturing. But the Canadian economic independence response has been methodical, strategic, and ultimately more effective than Washington's blunt force approach. From the Canada-Indonesia trade deal to surging consumer nationalism, the Trump-Canada tariffs backfire demonstrates how pressure tactics can strengthen rather than weaken targeted nations. When Lutnik told a Toronto audience about the Canada auto industry threat, Ontario Premier Doug Ford called it a massive threat that could only come with presidential approval. For many Canadians, this moment made trade tensions deeply personal. But instead of surrender, Ottawa chose precision. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government began reinforcing the very system Washington tried to undermine, triggering a Canadian economic independence movement that transformed weakness into industrial strategy. The Trump-Canada tariffs strategy ignored a fundamental reality: the two economies are inseparable. A car built in Ontario contains more than 50% U.S.-sourced parts, according to the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. The U.S. sells more finished vehicles to Canada than any other country. Ontario alone employs 500,000 workers in auto production and parts manufacturing, with major brands like Volkswagen and Stellantis building large-scale battery plants there. This integration is precisely why the Trump-Canada tariffs backfire was inevitable. A Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association report showed U.S. automakers projected to pay $188 billion in additional tariff costs between 2025 and 2028, taxes paid by American companies on imports from their own Canadian suppliers. The Canada auto industry threat became a self-inflicted wound. As vehicle prices climbed and slowdowns spread across states the policy was meant to protect. Rather than reacting with anger to the Canada auto industry threat, Ottawa demonstrated calculated Canadian economic independence. Canada maintained a 25% counter tariff on U.S. vehicles, but offered a remission framework for companies keeping production and employment inside Canada. The federal government launched a $2 billion strategic response fund to help manufacturers absorb shock, transforming the Trump-Canada tariffs disruption into long-term independence strategy. This Canadian economic independence approach prioritized domestic EV battery production, invested in nickel and lithium processing, and encouraged automakers to source components locally. By linking the auto sector to critical minerals development, Canada transformed the Canada auto industry threat into industrial opportunity. Major manufacturers responded not by leaving, but expanding. Volkswagen and Stellantis proceeded with planned facilities, while Japanese and American automakers reaffirmed that Canada's stable workforce and energy supply made it a safer long-term base. The Trump-Canada tariffs backfire became undeniable. Policies designed to bring jobs back to the U.S. instead strengthened Canada's manufacturing ecosystem. What started as economic warfare became quiet realignment, leaving Canada more self-reliant than before. The most dramatic expression of Canadian economic independence came in late September, when Canada and Indonesia signed a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, Canada's first-ever free trade agreement with an ASEAN nation. The Canada-Indonesia trade deal timing was deliberate. It happened precisely when Trump expanded tariffs, symbolizing that Ottawa would no longer wait for Washington's approval. The Canada-Indonesia trade deal wasn't accidental. With nearly 300 million people and $2 trillion GDP, Indonesia represents Southeast Asia's largest economy projected to reach the world's top 5 within decades. Once fully enforced in 2026, the Canada-Indonesia trade deal eliminates or reduces over 95% of tariffs on Canadian exports, providing competitive access for agricultural products, fertilizer, wood, financial services, and clean technology. This Canadian economic independence move includes an $800 million partnership between Export Development Canada and the Indonesia Investment Authority for Infrastructure, Renewable Energy, and Advanced Manufacturing. The Canada-Indonesia trade deal isn't just about moving containers. It positions Canadian industries inside one of the planet's fastest-growing markets, while the Trump-Canada tariffs strategy isolates American businesses. The Trump-Canada tariffs backfire extended beyond government policy into consumer behavior. According to Statistics Canada, Canadian residents returning from the U.S. by car fell 34% in August compared to last year, the 8th straight monthly decline. Air travel to the U.S. dropped 25% year over year. Sales of Canadian-authored books at Indigo rose 25%. These aren't small cultural shifts. They show populations adjusting choices in direct reaction to the Canada auto industry threat and broader American pressure. Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem told business leaders that Canada must diversify, remove internal trade barriers, and open overseas markets. Prime Minister Carney introduced the One Canadian Economy Act to eliminate internal trade barriers and fast-track national projects. What was supposed to weaken Canada through the Trump-Canada tariff strategy instead accelerated reforms strengthening Canadian economic independence. Washington's talk of Canada becoming the 51st state was meant to remind Canadians of their dependence. Instead, it had the opposite effect on Canadian economic independence. The U.S. ambassador complained Canada ran an anti-American campaign, but Canadians saw something different, a nation asserting its identity under threat. Provinces most exposed to the Canada auto industry threat, Ontario with autos, Quebec with aluminum and softwood, saw public support for Buy Canadian campaigns intensify. Ontario's premier protesting a Crown Royal bottling shift to the U.S. captured the national mood. Even in Saskatchewan and Alberta, where oil and agriculture were spared heavy tariffs, consensus emerged that Canada must reach global markets without American approval. The Trump-Canada tariffs strategy created momentum for Canadian economic independence that Washington never anticipated. Exports to the U.S. fell about 2% according to Statistics Canada, but exports to other countries rose. Diversification in action. The Canada-Indonesia trade deal represents one example among many as Ottawa builds infrastructure moving goods east and west more efficiently, reducing southern border dependence. Every Canada auto industry threat, every insult, every tariff backfired, turning pressure strategy into nation-building project. The Trump-Canada tariffs backfire demonstrates that in integrated economies, power built on disruption rarely lasts. Real strength comes from cooperation, consistency, and credibility. In trying to corner Canada, Trump may have become the unexpected architect of a more independent Canadian nation. The Canadian economic independence surge, symbolized by the Canada-Indonesia trade deal and consumer nationalism, proves that threats can strengthen rather than weaken, especially when directed at nations with options, resources, and resolve.